Hello everybody and welcome to PMGT 4030 Risk, PMGT 4030 of the PM Lab. Today these lectures are about risk management. So before we kick into that, just kind of go over in your mind A, B, and C, the process groups, how they interact with the project management plan and the project documents. I think that's a very important point to continue to remind yourself of. Okay. Then here are the objectives for risk management this week. Take pause now and review that at your leisure. Make sure you have a good grasp of what we're trying to accomplish. Okay, project risk management. You know, the objective of risk management is to optimize the success of the project. Your project has been fraught with risks from the beginning. If you can recall back in cost management week, I gave a couple of slides and showed you how we had been talking about cost for many lessons without actually saying it. Well, in reality, we've been talking much more about risk without actually talking about it, even as it ties to cost. Remember the formula PERT for Program Evaluation and Review Technique. There was beta and triangular, and beta, which is more conservative, is the optimistic plus 4 times the most likely plus the pessimistic divided by 6. That's actually a risk management tool meant in cost or schedule management to reduce your risk. So we've been talking about this for a long time, and we want to optimize the chances of success. That's what PERT was really doing for you. So we want to increase the likelihood of positive risks happening and decrease or eliminate negative risks from happening. And we're going to do that through these following 6 processes. Like always, except in stakeholder management, where the first process is ID, stakeholders, like always in every other knowledge area that has a plan in the project plan, we will plan first. So we plan risk management, which is about how we're going to conduct risk management activities. Then we'll ID the risks. We'll perform qualitative and then quantitative analysis. Qualitative is subjective probability and impact. Quantitative is numeric, important words for the exams. Then we will plan risk responses, implement them as necessary, and monitor risks throughout the processes of risk management. So there's some key concepts as covered in the literature beginning on page 397 and following. All projects have risk. I used to start by asking students, tell me a project without risk. It was a joke. It was a trick. There aren't any. They all have varying degrees of complexity and risk versus reward. So there are 2 important points I would like to distinguish here that the new version of the PMBOK guide talks about a lot throughout this chapter. One is individual project risk, which is an uncertainty with a positive or negative effect. That's frankly risk. And we want to exploit the positive risks and minimize or get rid of the negative risks. So there's individual risks. Now, new to the PMBOK guide is this sense of overall project risk, separate from the individual risks. And this is uncertainty for the project as a whole, from all the resources, including the individual risks. And it aims so that we'll define a range of risk that's acceptable, and overall risk seeks to keep it within that range. And when we talk about range, there's probably going to be some variation. We want to promote positive variation and reduce negative. We want to maximize the probability of achieving the overall project objectives. We will go through this iteratively, which I mean time and again. And we have to seek a level of risk exposure that is acceptable. So what is the risk exposure? That this is some sort of measurable threshold that reflects our stakeholders' risk appetite, right? What's that acceptable variation? So I drew a slide as I see it happening based on these three definitions of risk appetite, which is the degree of uncertainty, the risk tolerance, which is the degree that stakeholders can withstand, and the risk threshold, the point where it's no longer acceptable. So you see on my slide, I have a risk threshold, bam, above that you've got nothing. It's no longer acceptable. And then at the very bottom in the corner left, I have that's acceptable risk. They have a risk appetite for that degree of uncertainty versus reward, that's acceptable. But then there's this point in the middle that you have to figure out, which is the risk tolerance. What's the degree that risk stakeholders can accept? Okay, and that's what that slide's about. So then we talk about, the PMBOK guide then goes on further to talk about trends in project management. That's on page 398 and 399. What I find are are non-event risks have a variability risk and an ambiguity risk. So the PMBOK guide will now talk about event risks, like individual risks, and non-event risks. So there's a variability risk. There's uncertainty, right? And ambiguity, where imperfect knowledge may affect project objectives, right? What if the expert external input is wrong? What if benchmarking was inconclusive or unsubstantiated? Okay, and those are some examples. So know those terms: variability risk, right, which is uncertainty about some key characteristics of high variability environments like weather. And then there's ambiguity risk, which is imperfect knowledge that affects objectives. And then review the rest of the trends and tailoring on page 400. Okay, now here is a one-slide summary of all things in the project management knowledge area. Across the top, you see the 7 processes, and you'll see that repeated in yellow towards the bottom. Then you'll have what you're really doing within each of those. So in plan risk management, you're going to determine how you conduct risk management. I remind you that risk management plan is called a constraint or a subsidiary plan, and it becomes our methodology. And the output then is the risk management plan. In identify risks, I tell you that there are 3 parts to identify risks. It's identify the actual risk, identify the sources, and document the characteristics. So you're going to identify all of the risks, not just some of them. You're going to do this through stakeholder interviews, documentation, SWOT analysis, checklists, etc. You're even going to identify categories, and by doing that you can affinitize the characteristics or put them in a grouping, which means you can address risk responses to that group. And you'll make each risk clear and unambiguous, right? And nominate owners. The output then, at the bottom, is going to be a risk register, risk reports, and document updates. My third is qualitative analysis, and I said this was subjective probability and impact that can give the risk a number. And you're going to do this for all risks. All risks will go under qualitative analysis. And the point is to prioritize the risks and determine which you're going to address now and which go on a watch list, something you're going to keep an eye on, but you may not do a response plan for it right now. And you may do some of this subjective probability impact by doing things like a risk workshop. In this process, you confirm now the process, the risk owners. And then there's quantitative analysis, where now it's a numeric probability impact to the few risks that we said, ooh, these are high priority, we really need to identify some contingency reserves. So you'll begin to determine the initial reserves using things like Monte Carlo method, expected monetary value or EMV, decision trees, expert judgment, etc. Okay? And you see the outputs at the bottom. which is document updates. That's it. I give 2 examples, like a risk report and a risk register. Then I'm going to plan risk responses, which means what are my options? Developing options. What's my strategy to maximize the opportunity of an individual risk or minimize or mitigate or eliminate the negative aspects of a threat? And so I'm also going to determine secondary risks as a new term. That's a new risk that is a result of implementing a current risk response. Another term below that is a residual risk. Those are risks left after response planning. And then fallback plans is a third definition, when contingency plans are ineffective. By now, at the end of plan risk responses, for a few key high priority risks, I have now determined my contingency reserves. Then I'm going to implement risk responses as needed by watching, and I'm going to monitor risks. Okay, kind of a summary of all things project management, risk management knowledge area.